September 8, 1943. The day Italy announced its armistice with the Allied forces. In a small administrative office outside Naples, 24-year-old Lucia Romano sat frozen at her desk, staring at the radio that had just delivered news that seemed impossible to comprehend. Around her, other women from the Auxiliary Territorial Service moved in stunned silence, their carefully maintained military bearing crumbling under the weight of what they had just heard. Their country had surrendered. But to whom? And what did that mean for women like them, who had spent the past 2 years serving what they believed was their nation's defense? The answer came faster than any of them expected. Within hours, chaos erupted throughout southern Italy as German forces, once their allies, turned hostile. Allied troops pushed inland from their landing sites at Salerno, and the women found themselves caught in a military collapse that moved with terrifying speed. Lucia grabbed the small leather-bound photograph album from her desk drawer, the only possession that truly mattered to her. Inside were images of her family in Rome, her mother, her 2 younger sisters, and her father, who had been killed in North Africa the previous year. She pressed the album against her chest as explosions echoed in the distance, closer than they had been an hour before. The commanding officer, an exhausted Italian colonel, gathered the 37 women in their unit. His face was gray with defeat and uncertainty. "Pack only what you can carry," he told them in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "We are evacuating north, but I cannot promise where we will end up or what will happen to us." But they never made it north. Their convoy ran directly into an American advance unit on the coastal road. Lucia remembered every detail of that moment with crystal clarity for the rest of her life, the way the setting sun glinted off the American tanks, making them look like enormous metal beasts emerging from mythology rather than war. The way the soldiers who approached their vehicles seemed impossibly tall, impossibly well-fed, and impossibly calm. An American officer stepped forward, his uniform crisp despite the dust of combat. He was young, perhaps 30, with dark hair and eyes that reminded Lucia achingly of her own people. When he spoke, it was in halting, heavily accented Italian. "Signorine, you are now prisoners of the United States Army. We will treat you with respect and according to international law. You have nothing to fear from us." Lucia looked into his face, searching for cruelty, for the brutality she had been told defined the American character. Instead, she saw something that terrified her more than hatred ever could. She saw kindness, tinged with what appeared to be genuine concern. As she and the other women were loaded onto American transport trucks, Lucia clutched her photograph album tighter and wondered what kind of enemy offers comfort to those they have just defeated. The journey to America took 3 weeks, though it felt like a lifetime suspended between 2 worlds. Lucia and the other Italian women were held first in a temporary processing facility in Naples, where American administrative personnel cataloged their names, ranks, and service records with a thoroughness that seemed almost obsessive. The women were fingerprinted, photographed, and interviewed through interpreters about their roles in the Italian Auxiliary Service. Throughout the process, Lucia noticed something that continued to unsettle her. The Americans treated paperwork with more intensity than they treated their prisoners. The forms seemed to matter more than the fear in the women's eyes. When they finally boarded the transport ship bound for New York, Lucia stood on the deck, watching the Italian coastline disappear into the Mediterranean haze. Beside her, Maria Castellano, a 31-year-old radio operator from Sicily, stared at the vanishing land with tears streaming down her weathered face. Maria had lost her husband at Anzio and had joined the service because she had nothing left to lose. Now she was losing even the ground that held his memory. The crossing was rough, with autumn storms turning the Atlantic into a churning mass of gray water that seemed to mirror the turmoil in the women's hearts. They were housed in a converted cargo hold that had been outfitted with bunks, separate from male prisoners, but still unmistakably a prison. American guards rotated in shifts, always professional, always maintaining a distance that somehow felt more respectful than hostile. But it was the small observations that began to reshape their understanding of their captors. The American soldiers seemed impossibly young and impossibly large, not just in physical stature, though many of them towered over the Italian women, but in the way they moved through the world with a confidence that bordered on innocence. They smiled easily, laughed often, and treated their duties with a casual competence that suggested they had never truly known deprivation or defeat. One evening, as Lucia lay in her bunk fighting seasickness, she overheard two American guards talking outside the hold entrance. They were discussing baseball, a sport she had only vague knowledge of, debating the merits of players whose names sounded like poetry: DiMaggio, Williams, Musial. The ease in their voices, the way they could discuss games and statistics while guarding enemy prisoners, suggested a separation between war and life that Lucia found both admirable and incomprehensible. In Italy, the war had consumed everything. There was no space left for games, for lightness, for the luxury of caring about anything so trivial as sports. When the transport finally arrived in New York Harbor, Lucia stood on deck with the other women, staring at the Manhattan skyline in the early morning light. The buildings rose higher than seemed possible, monuments to a country that had somehow avoided the devastation that had turned European cities into rubble. Everything about them seemed larger: their buildings, their soldiers, their capacity to wage war while somehow remaining untouched by its worst horrors. Lucia realized with a shock that frightened her more than any battlefield, she was not looking at her enemy. She was looking at a world she had never imagined existed. Camp Reynolds sat in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by farmland that reminded Lucia painfully of the countryside outside Rome. The facility had been hastily constructed to house the growing number of Axis prisoners flowing into America, and it showed in the raw lumber of the barracks and the fresh wire of the fencing. But unlike the prison camps Lucia had seen in newsreels of Allied captives, this place seemed almost comfortable in its austerity. The barracks were clean, the grounds orderly, and the American flag snapping in the October wind seemed more like a declaration of identity than a symbol of conquest. The 37 Italian women were processed through an intake procedure that felt more like checking into a hospital than entering captivity. They were given medical examinations by a female doctor who spoke no Italian, but whose gentle hands and concerned expression communicated more than words. They were issued clean uniforms, not prison stripes, but simple gray work clothes that could have belonged to any factory worker. They were shown to their barracks, where each woman received her own bunk with clean sheets, a footlocker, and a small window that looked out over the Pennsylvania hills. It was more privacy and comfort than many of them had known even before the war. Captain James Bradley introduced himself to the assembled women on their first evening at Camp Reynolds. He stood before them in the mess hall, his uniform pressed, his posture military but somehow lacking the rigid severity of Italian or German officers. When he began to speak, it was in Italian broken, grammatically tortured Italian that would have been comical in any other circumstance. Buonasera, signorine. Mi chiamo Capitano Bradley. My familia is from Napoli. My nonno, my grandfather, he come to America 50 years before. I speak not good Italiano, but I try. You are here safe. We treat you with rispetto. Lucia glanced at Maria, whose face had hardened into a mask of suspicion. This was a trick, Maria's expression suggested. This was manipulation designed to lower their defenses, to make them forget that they were prisoners in enemy hands. But Lucia found herself focusing on the captain's earnest struggle with her language, the way he paused to search for words, the slight flush of embarrassment when he clearly chose the wrong verb tense. There was something genuine in his effort, something that contradicted the propaganda image of Americans as cultural barbarians who cared nothing for the traditions of older civilizations. After the captain's introduction, a sergeant began explaining the camp rules through a more competent interpreter. The women would be expected to work, but the labor would be reasonable laundry, kitchen duties, administrative tasks, nothing that violated the Geneva Convention's provisions for prisoner treatment. They would receive the same rations as American soldiers. They would have access to medical care, religious services, and recreational time. They would be allowed to write letters home, though all correspondence would be censored. They would be treated, the sergeant emphasized, as human beings who happened to be on the wrong side of a conflict, not as enemies worthy of hatred. That night, lying in her bunk listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American military facility, Lucia felt the first crack in the certainty she had carried since her capture. Everything about this place contradicted what she had been taught to expect. The question that kept her awake was more unsettling than fear. If the Americans were not who she had been told they were, what else had been a lie? The first week at Camp Reynolds passed in a fog of confusion and adjustment. Lucia found herself assigned to the administrative office, where her neat handwriting and basic English skills made her useful for filing and organizing records. It was clerical work, mindless and safe, but it placed her in close proximity to the American staff who ran the facility. This proximity forced her to witness details that challenged everything she wanted to believe about her captors. Private Thomas Walsh worked at the desk next to hers. He was 19 years old, barely more than a boy, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger. He came from a farming family in Iowa and had joined the Army the day after Pearl Harbor, driven by patriotic fury that had since mellowed into a kind of resigned duty. He treated Lucia with an awkward courtesy that seemed rooted in genuine discomfort with the idea of her being a prisoner. Each morning, he would greet her with a shy, "Good morning, Miss Romano," as if she were a colleague rather than an enemy national under armed guard. One afternoon in late October, Lucia made an error in filing a stack of requisition forms. She had misunderstood the American dating system, placing documents marked 10/15 in October rather than the 15th of October. It was a small mistake, but one that created hours of additional work to correct. She discovered the error late in the day and felt her chest tighten with anxiety. In the Italian military system she had known, mistakes were punished swiftly and often harshly, especially for women who were already viewed as less capable than their male counterparts. Private Walsh noticed her distress before she could hide it. He walked over to her desk and looked at the misfiled documents, understanding the problem immediately. Lucia braced herself for anger, for the sharp rebuke she deserved. Instead, Walsh smiled a gentle, understanding smile that somehow made her feel worse than any punishment could have. "Hey, don't worry about it," he said in his slow, Midwestern accent. "I did the same thing my first week. The date thing confuses everybody. Here, I'll help you resort them. We'll have it fixed before Captain Bradley even knows there was a problem." They worked together for the next 2 hours, Walsh patiently explaining the American system while sharing stories about life on his family's farm. He talked about his mother's cooking, about harvest seasons, about a girl named Sarah who was waiting for him back home. He spoke as if Lucia were a friend, someone whose company he enjoyed rather than tolerated. The kindness was unbearable. Lucia found herself fighting tears as they worked, not from gratitude but from a deeper, more complicated emotion she had no name for. That evening, Maria found Lucia sitting alone outside the barracks, staring at the darkening Pennsylvania hills. "You're getting too comfortable with them," Maria said, her voice hard with judgment. "You're forgetting that we're prisoners. You're forgetting that these are the people who bombed our cities, who killed our soldiers." Lucia wanted to argue, wanted to defend Private Walsh's simple human decency, but the words caught in her throat. Because Maria was right about one thing, accepting kindness from the enemy felt like the deepest form of betrayal. The question Lucia couldn't answer was whether she was betraying Italy or betraying her own heart. November brought the first letters from Italy, and with them, a grief more profound than captivity itself. The International Red Cross had established communication channels for prisoners of war, and slowly, painfully, news began to filter through from the world the women had left behind. Not all of it came in the form of letters. Some arrived through official notifications, brief and bureaucratic, informing prisoners of deaths or displacements that had occurred in their absence. Lucia received her first letter on a gray Tuesday morning. The envelope had been opened and resealed by censors, and the paper inside was thin, almost translucent, the kind that could carry more words across an ocean while weighing less. Her mother's handwriting was shakier than Lucia remembered, the letters formed with obvious difficulty. The message was brief, constrained by what was safe to write under occupation. "My dearest Lucia, we are alive. That is all I can say with certainty. Your sisters and I remain in Rome, though the city is not what you remember. Food is scarce. Many of our neighbors have disappeared, some fled south, some were taken north. We do not know which is worse. Do not worry for us, but pray. Your loving mother." Lucia read the letter 7 times, searching between the careful words for truths her mother couldn't write directly. "Many of our neighbors have disappeared" meant the Jewish families who had lived on their street were gone. "The city is not what you remember" meant destruction, occupation, fear. "Do not worry for us" meant they were in danger every day. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the leather photograph album she kept in her footlocker, next to the pictures of a Rome that no longer existed. Maria received no letter, but she received an official notification. Her elderly parents, who had been living in a small village outside Palermo, had died in an Allied bombing raid in August. The notification was sterile in its efficiency: names, dates, location. Nothing about who they had been, what they had meant, how they had died. Maria read the single page, folded it precisely, and walked out of the barracks without speaking. Lucia found her hours later sitting behind the administration building, staring at nothing, her face dry but her eyes holding a grief too deep for tears. Other women received similar news or received nothing at all, which was somehow worse. Giovanna Russo, a 26-year-old former typist from Milan, waited every day for word from her husband, who had been serving with an infantry unit on the Eastern Front. No news came. The silence was its own form of torture, leaving her suspended between hope and despair, unable to mourn or to move forward. The irony was inescapable and bitter. The women were safe, well-fed, and protected in an enemy prison camp, while their loved ones starved, suffered, and died in their homeland. Gratitude became another word for guilt. December brought influenza to Camp Reynolds with the first serious snowfall. It started with Private Walsh, who showed up to work one morning with a fever and a cough he tried unsuccessfully to hide. By the end of the week, it had spread through the facility like wildfire, infecting guards and prisoners alike with democratic indifference to nationality or allegiance. The camp's small medical facility, designed to handle routine ailments and minor injuries, was quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients requiring care. Lucia fell ill on a Thursday evening, feeling the familiar ache in her bones that preceded fever. By Friday morning, she could barely lift her head from her pillow. Around her, other women lay in similar states of misery. The barracks transformed into an impromptu infirmary. But it was Maria whose condition deteriorated most rapidly and most frighteningly. The fever that began in her lungs seemed to settle deeper, and by Saturday night she was struggling to breathe, her lips taking on a bluish tinge that terrified everyone who saw it. Captain Bradley made the decision to move the sickest patients, including Maria and 7 other women, to the main medical building where they could receive more intensive care. Dr. Samuel Klein, the camp's chief medical officer, was a 52-year-old veteran of the First World War, who had seen his share of influenza epidemics. He took one look at Maria's labored breathing and made a call that would have been unthinkable in many prisoner-of-war facilities. He requisitioned additional medical supplies from the nearest army hospital, brought in 2 civilian nurses from the local town, and announced that he would treat the Italian prisoners with the same aggressive intervention he would use for American soldiers. For 3 days and nights, Dr. Klein and his staff worked around the clock. They administered oxygen through precious rubber masks, injected experimental sulfa drugs that were still in limited supply, and monitored vital signs with the intensity of people fighting a battle they were determined not to lose. Lucia, recovering more quickly than Maria, watched from her bed as American medical personnel moved through the ward with exhausted dedication. Private Walsh, himself barely recovered from his own bout with the illness, volunteered to sit with patients during his off-duty hours, reading to them in English they couldn't fully understand, but found comforting nonetheless. On the 4th day, Maria's fever broke during the early morning hours. Dr. Klein, who had been checking on her every 2 hours despite his own obvious exhaustion, stood by her bedside and allowed himself a rare smile. When Maria opened her eyes and breathed normally for the first time in days, she looked up at the gray-haired American doctor and whispered in Italian, "Why?" Dr. Klein didn't speak Italian, but he understood the question behind the word. He placed his hand gently on her forehead, checking for remaining fever, and replied in English that Maria wouldn't understand, but somehow felt in her bones. "Because that's what doctors do, miss. We save lives. It doesn't matter whose." The winter of 1944 transformed Camp Reynolds in ways that went beyond the snow that blanketed the Pennsylvania hills. Something fundamental had shifted during the influenza outbreak. A barrier that had separated captors from captives had dissolved in the shared vulnerability of illness and the shared relief of recovery. The women who had once performed their assigned duties with mechanical compliance began to volunteer for additional work. Not from obligation, but from something that looked remarkably like purpose. Lucia discovered this change in herself almost by accident. One January morning, Captain Bradley was struggling to communicate with a newly arrived group of Italian prisoners, male soldiers captured in North Africa who spoke no English whatsoever. The camp's official interpreter was sick, and Bradley's fractured Italian was proving insufficient for the detailed processing requirements. Lucia, working at her usual desk in the administration office, watched the captain's growing frustration for 10 minutes before something inside her made a decision her conscious mind hadn't fully authorized. She stood up, walked to where Bradley stood surrounded by confused prisoners, and said in clear English, "Captain, may I help?" What began as a single morning of emergency translation became Lucia's new role within the camp. She discovered she had an aptitude for languages that went beyond simple vocabulary. She could sense the emotional content beneath words, could bridge not just linguistic differences, but cultural ones. When Italian prisoners arrived frightened and hostile, she could speak to them in ways that acknowledged their fear, while helping them understand that cooperation here meant survival rather than surrender. When American officers needed to communicate complex instructions, she could translate not just the words but the intent, softening commands that might sound harsh in direct translation. Captain Bradley quickly recognized her value and officially designated her as the camp's primary Italian liaison. The position came with a small private office, access to reference materials, and a responsibility that filled the empty hours that had once been occupied only by worry and guilt. Lucia threw herself into the work with an intensity that surprised her. She created glossaries of common terms, developed standardized translations for camp regulations, and even began teaching basic Italian to American guards who would be deploying to Italy and wanted to communicate better with local populations. The teaching became unexpectedly popular. Twice a week, Lucia held informal classes in the recreation hall, where guards could learn conversational Italian. Private Walsh was her most dedicated student, practicing phrases with an earnestness that made her smile despite herself. Other women joined the teaching effort. Giovanna, still waiting for news of her husband, began teaching American soldiers about Italian culture and customs. Anna Marchetti, a former schoolteacher from Florence, organized literacy classes for younger Italian male prisoners who had left school early to join the military. But even as purpose filled their days, guilt shadowed their nights. Maria, fully recovered from her illness, challenged Lucia one evening with words that cut deep. "We're not just surviving anymore, Lucia. We're helping them. We're teaching them our language so they can occupy our country more effectively. How is that different from collaboration?" Lucia had no answer that satisfied either of them. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The news crackled through the camp's loudspeakers in the early afternoon, and within minutes, the sounds of celebration echoed across the compound. American guards whooped and hollered, some firing shots into the air despite officers' attempts to maintain order. Church bells rang from the nearby town, their joyful peals carrying across the Pennsylvania countryside. The war in Europe was over. Germany had surrendered. The nightmare that had consumed the world for 6 years was finally, impossibly, ending. But in the barracks housing the Italian women, the celebration was muted and complicated. Lucia sat on her bunk, listening to the Americans' joy, and felt only a hollow uncertainty. The war was over, which meant repatriation would begin soon. She should have felt relief, even happiness. Instead, she felt something closer to dread. Over the following weeks, official communications from Washington began arriving at Camp Reynolds. Repatriation procedures for Italian prisoners would commence immediately. Italy was now technically an Allied co-belligerent, having switched sides in the war, but the country itself was devastated. The North had been a battlefield for months. Cities lay in ruins. The government was fragmented and weak. Food shortages were endemic. The social fabric had been torn apart by years of fascist rule, occupation, and civil conflict. Letters from Italy painted increasingly desperate pictures. Lucia's mother wrote that Rome was filled with displaced persons, former soldiers, and refugees with nowhere to go. The black market was the only reliable source of food. Buildings that had stood for centuries were rubble. Jobs were non-existent. The letter's subtext was clear: there was nothing to come home to, no life waiting that resembled the one Lucia had left. Other women received similar news or received no news at all, which was its own form of answer. Giovanna finally learned that her husband had died in a Soviet prison camp in 1943. She received the notification 22 months after his death, time that had been spent hoping for a reunion that would never come. Maria learned that her village in Sicily had been occupied by German forces during the Allied invasion, then liberated in combat that left it largely destroyed. The neighbors who had known her family were scattered across southern Italy, refugees in their own country. Captain Bradley called a meeting of all Italian women prisoners in mid-May to discuss repatriation procedures. He stood before them with documents in hand, but his expression was troubled rather than celebratory. "Ladies," he began, with Lucia translating his words, "you will all be processed for return to Italy within the next 4 to 6 weeks. However, I need to be honest with you about what you'll be returning to." What followed was the most honest briefing any of them had received about conditions in their homeland, the devastation, the chaos, the uncertainty. Bradley didn't sugarcoat the reality, and his candor forced the women to confront questions they had been avoiding. What did it mean to go home when home no longer existed? The decision crystallized on a warm evening in late May. The 37 Italian women gathered in their barracks after dinner, ostensibly to discuss practical matters about their upcoming repatriation. But the conversation that unfolded was far deeper and more painful than logistics about transport schedules. They spoke in Italian, their voices low and intense, wrestling with a question that seemed impossible to answer: where did they belong? Lucia found herself at the center of the discussion, perhaps because her role as translator had given her the most interaction with both American staff and the reality of what awaited them in Italy. She held a letter from her mother, received just that morning. "She says there is no work in Rome," Lucia told the assembled women. "She says they are living on charity from the church and occasional black market purchases. She says," her voice broke slightly, "she says she doesn't know how they would feed me if I came home." Maria spoke next, her voice carrying an edge of defiance that had never fully left her despite the months of complicated transformation. "So, what are you saying, Lucia? That we should abandon our country when it needs us most? That we should choose comfort with our former enemies over duty to our homeland?" The question hung in the air, and Lucia realized she didn't have a good answer. Or rather, she had an answer that felt like treason to speak aloud. It was Giovanna who finally said what many of them were thinking. She stood up, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I have nothing to go back to," she said simply. "My husband is dead. My family's home was destroyed. I spent 18 months in this camp learning English, learning skills, finding—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Finding myself again after losing everything. Here, I am someone. In Italy, I would be just another widow, just another mouth to feed in a country that has no food. The admission opened a floodgate. Other women began speaking, their voices overlapping in a cascade of confession and justification. Anna Marchetti talked about the teaching she had been doing, how she had discovered a purpose in education that transcended nationality. Francesca Lombardi, a former nurse, spoke about continuing her medical training under Dr. Klein's mentorship. One by one, 11 women articulated a truth that felt both liberating and deeply shameful. They wanted to stay. Captain Bradley received the news the following morning when Lucia entered his office with a formal request. Her English had become fluent over the months, and she chose her words carefully. "Captain, I am speaking on behalf of 11 women in our group. We wish to request consideration for remaining in the United States rather than immediate repatriation. We understand this is unprecedented. We understand we have no right to ask. But we are asking anyway." Bradley sat in stunned silence for a long moment before responding. "Miss Romano, you're asking to remain prisoners rather than accept freedom? Do you understand how impossible that sounds?" Lucia met his eyes steadily. "We're not asking to remain prisoners, Captain. We're asking for the chance to stop being prisoners entirely." 23 years after that unprecedented request in Captain Bradley's office, Lucia Romano Bradley stood in her kitchen in suburban Philadelphia, preparing Sunday dinner for a family that represented everything impossible made real. Her husband, James Bradley, now a retired colonel, sat in the living room teaching their teenage son basic Italian phrases while their daughter practiced piano in the background. The sounds of this ordinary American life still sometimes struck Lucia as miraculous, that she had gone from enemy prisoner to beloved wife, from foreigner to citizen, from someone defined by war to someone defined by love. The journey from that May morning in 1945 to this peaceful Sunday afternoon had been neither simple nor guaranteed. Captain Bradley had fought bureaucratic battles for months to secure displaced person status for the 11 women who chose to stay. The War Department had been skeptical, the State Department confused, and public opinion divided. But Bradley had been relentless, arguing that America's greatest strength lay not in how it treated its friends, but in how it transformed its enemies. The women had been reclassified, released from prisoner status, and given the opportunity to apply for immigration. Each had needed sponsors, employment, and housing. The Bradley family had sponsored Lucia, offering her a room in their home and supporting her application to work as a translator for the State Department's Displaced Persons Office. The work had been emotionally devastating and deeply meaningful. Lucia spent years helping process the flood of European refugees coming to America, using her own experience of displacement to bridge cultural gaps and ease traumatic transitions. She translated not just words but hope, helping shattered people imagine that life could be rebuilt even after complete destruction. Maria had eventually returned to Italy in 1948, after the worst of the chaos had subsided. But she carried with her a different understanding of America than the one she had arrived with as a prisoner. She became a teacher in reconstructed Sicily, and her letters to Lucia over the decades spoke of building schools, educating new generations, and keeping alive the memory that even enemies could show mercy. Of the 11 women who stayed, 9 had built extraordinary American lives. They became nurses, teachers, businesswomen, and mothers. They married American veterans who saw in them not enemies but fellow survivors of a war that had scarred everyone it touched. Their children grew up hearing stories about a prison camp in Pennsylvania where kindness had defeated hatred, where small gestures of humanity had proven more powerful than propaganda. As Lucia called her family to dinner that Sunday evening, she thought about the young woman she had been when she first saw those impossibly large American officers approaching her convoy on an Italian coastal road. Everything about them had seemed larger: their physical presence, their confidence, their capacity for both war and mercy. But what she had learned over 23 years was that America itself was larger than she had imagined. Large enough to hold contradictions, to transform enemies into citizens, to prove that identity could be chosen rather than merely inherited. She had come to this country as a prisoner. She had stayed as an immigrant. she had become impossibly and completely American.